get this show on the road. Well, welcome everyone to the SingularityNet Decentralized OS series with a specific focus on decentralized finance. We are very fortunate today to have Joel Dietz, as OG as they come in the crypto space. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's an intellectual historian. He's been involved in several key initiatives, and one of the most well-known is MetaMask, which if you're watching this, you know what it is. So you can thank Joel for that. Or I guess if you really don't like it, I suppose you could curse Joel, but we appreciate what he did for the space in that respect. But he's gone much more beyond that. We're going to touch on all of those things. His research these days focuses on the confluence of blockchain, network topologies, and swarm intelligence. So we'll talk a little bit about his current projects, and especially how those principles undergirding decentralized organizations can be used to fuel global innovation, which is something we obviously sorely need. He also works on something called holonic philosophy, which I don't know what it is, but we're also going to find out what that is. The evolution of jurisprudence, data-driven approaches to innovation, and smart city data architecture. I don't know when he finds time to sleep, but he seems to be doing a lot of really fascinating things. So Joel, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I wanted to just start off with a little bit. We always like to get to know our guests. So Joel, maybe you could just give us a little bit. When did you first discover Bitcoin? When did you first discover Ethereum? And what was it that lit you up about that experience?
I guess I've been reading, alternative economic literature for a long time, as well as mainstream. I basically read Hacker News every day for as long as Hacker News has existed. So, I read about Bitcoin back 2010. I was not initially convinced that it would be anything of significance. And even back then, it was pretty obvious that it was kind of a little bit polarizing. People either loved it or hated it. And, some people were very put off by the energy intensivity. I actually was a bit of a skeptic back then. And I was annoyed because I was reading Hacker News all the time. And all these Bitcoin, threads would pop up. And I actually wrote a filter, it's still on GitHub, for Hacker News that sorted things based on what you wanted to see, because I was into Lisp languages at the time. So I was like, I would much rather see Lisp-related posts highlighted in Hacker News and, people who are cryptocurrency punks or whatever, not always right at the top of the thing and all the controversies about it. So ironically, my first contribution to cryptocurrency was actually a filter that filtered out some aspects of cryptocurrency. I mean, it was customizable, so you could set it however you want. But then I was working very heavily on other types of digital currency with actual communities that were kind of off-grid communities that wanted to, build resilient futures for themselves. And that was really tough. And among other things, because the regulators didn't allow you to innovate in the financial sector. Like everything you wanted to do required like €1 million license. I was in Europe at the time, in between Germany and Italy. And, just nothing you could do. If you have a startup, you can't send, this would be, at this time it would be away or something like that, but across one board to the next without getting a whole series of permissions in place and from people who had no clue what they were enabling. So after I went back and studied the history of digital currencies and what had happened, prior to Bitcoin and DigiCash and, some of the many other things that predate Bitcoin, I was like, this is pretty much the only way you could do it. And I had an extreme appreciation, especially seeing that, some of these people like David Chaum or whatever else came out with, the same kind of battle wounds from their first digital currency attempt that, I had. So, because I put my whole life savings into my, own digital currency, eco-currency. So it's even designed to be sustainable and have all this, both feel good but also very practical impact. And it was basically a failure. So, despite meeting a lot of interesting people.
That's pretty funny. You almost came at it from, it almost gives that skeptical, that's a common experience for people in crypto. A lot of people, the first time they hear about it, they're like, what the hell is this? It's never going to work. And then it sounds like you hit a practical use case that was really, it's a DeFi use case. It's this simple issue of how do I, international transfers, and if anyone's ever sent a wire transfer, they know the pain and the cost and the hassle associated with that. So that's really fascinating. So what was it then, sort of take us through that next step in the journey once you started to sort of feel that the potential? Where did you go from maybe skeptic to full-on believer? Take us through that story, if you will.
So, I was still actively following cryptocurrency-related news and Bitcoin Magazine, and I really liked Vitalik's essays in Bitcoin Magazine. They were very complete and treatments of every subject, so I was following him as a writer, and I kind of wanted to meet him or figure out something, kind of what he was working on, because it just seemed kind of cutting edge. And I've always been a technology enthusiast and like being at the edge of technological development. And then when the Ethereum white paper dropped, I was like, I had what I call a nerdgasm, and I think I may have invented that word, but it's just completely mind blown, and like, oh, this is going to change so many different things. I just started writing down all the different things that smart contracts could potentially do. And as someone who has studied a bit of organizational design before, and knows a little bit about the history of joint stock companies and stock markets and how equity things work, I was like, all these things can basically be programmed from scratch to be better than they are today. Besides the fact that you're just going to enable an immense amount of innovation, around other things, because one thing that was clear to me already is this nature of kind of open networks, and that basically if you have open networks, then, you can have anyone show up and innovate anytime, and that's just super exciting. And basically, it's kind of, when people say that Bitcoin is the internet of money or whatever else, I think it's very, very on point, because what websites allowed is anyone to just show up and start creating their version of art or thoughts or whatever else without anyone saying whether or not they were allowed to do it. And in my mind, that's the most exciting and colorful thing of the Ethereum world to this day, is that basically it's a network for open innovation.
So let me double click on that a little bit, because when new technology, first of all, I love the term nerdgasm. Is that open source? Do you mind if I use that again? Okay.
Yeah, please. I kind of feel like it should go on Urban Dictionary at some point.
I can certainly remember my journey down the rabbit hole, where that moment where I sat up on my couch and I was like, oh shit, this is a tsunami 50 miles off the coast and no one sees it's coming. But I didn't realize I was having a nerdgasm at the moment. So thank you for giving me the name on that one. So, and I've had multiple, there are the days with the multiple nerdgasms, but we'll leave that for another conversation. Some people are younger than others. But let me double click on that, because whenever a new innovation comes on the scene, there's sort of two approaches, right? The first approach, and tell me if you disagree with this premise, but the first approach is, hey, we can use this technology to do things we already do better, faster, cheaper. And that's like, enterprise DLT, or whether it's just, email as faster mail going back 20 years. But then and that's fine and that's great and we should do all that. But the really cool stuff is the stuff that was previously impossible. And that's where I think it sounds like some of the things that really got you excited. So help us think. I mean, you have a tremendous background with economics and open networks, and I know you have a passion for sustainability and collective intelligence. So when did you start sort of formulating your theories about what's possible now that these decentralized networks and Ethereum was really, captured so many imaginations? When did you start seeing, wait a second, there are things that there are massive global problems that can be addressed in entirely new ways? When did you start to realize that, and when did you start to formulate your theories about what was possible? I mean, take us through that story and how you're thinking about it these days. That's a lot, but you can handle it.
Well, I mean, in some ways it even predates Ethereum, and the first currency project that I started was called Greens, and it basically was an eco-currency where every time you deposited money, part of the base of that was in some ways the first stable coin, at least conceptually. was held in land-backed assets, and we had a partnership with the World Land Trust. So basically, they would secure land in Ecuador or other kind of rainforests, put it in a trust, and then basically hold on to it as a sort of preserve. Which I thought, conceptually, like, I guess maybe it's my technology temperament, but I don't have the necessarily trust in global governance as it currently exists to solve some of the largest problems that this planet has at this moment. And I think that's shared by many people.
You're not alone, Joel.
So I was, I was just thinking, well, maybe this type of technology can be used for it if we can get enough kind of people and traction behind it, and actually take it and use it to solve some of these issues. So that was like 2011, so it was way beyond and I was talking with Wired magazine this week about sustainability stuff, and it's always been an issue, as anyone in the Bitcoin space knows, regarding the energy efficiency of Bitcoin. But it's equally topical today, and I think just beyond that, once you get into DAOs, the first group I started the Ethereum Silicon Valley groups, that was, we were talking about everything, but then we created a second spin-off group called Decentralized Autonomous Society that was basically focused on all the governance-related applications of, this sector of technology. But since most of us were Ethereum people, it kind of was leaning an Ethereum thing, although we had Dash people show up, and we had, various other groups come through. And, the sky was the limit. Once you start applying DAOs at scale, and, at that time there were like 3 DAOs that really existed, or something like that. So it was very early. But yeah, once you start applying it at scale to certain types of problems, at some level, it almost feels like there's no problem you couldn't solve. It does partially depend on the accessibility, but at some level, if you think about, and I say this, and this is kind of a controversial thing to say to some people, but maybe not within this audience, but if you think of like governance as, a stack, of software, which I often do, it kind of comes pre-installed on your computer, It's kind of like the Internet Explorer of your country, so to speak. And you get all these functions, but then it also, these days at least, comes with a lot of spyware. There's a lot of people who've like figured out their way of like adding their own version of things that siphons off, this, that, and the other. And so it becomes increasingly painful to use for whatever its original intended purpose was. So, and for me, yeah, the pain is real, and I'm sure a lot of other people, feel that, especially with the Fed basically printing, trillions of dollars and inflating M1 and all of that right now.
Anyone, right?
U.S. person or anyone else who's kind of dependent on that currency system. So, so it is a concern, and it's been, a real issue for a while. From a historical perspective, historical stuff again, it's kind of why the Fed was created in the first place, because of, financial crises that weren't managed. And J.P. Morgan stepped in himself and basically bailed out the U.S. government and said, I don't want to do this anymore. We need something better than me doing this. But, the system we have isn't perfect, and now it has, its own deficiencies that are kind of being revealed. So anyways, I try to stay on the positive side, and that's a software thing, even if I don't like Internet Explorer with a bunch of spyware installed in it, it's still sometimes better than not having a web browser at all. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't build something that's better, and delivers the same public goods, resources, issues, kind of things without all of that.
So yeah, there's so many different directions to go on this one. I saw a stat the other day that something like 35% of all dollars ever created have been created since last March. It's just mind blowing. You look at that M1 chart, and it's like the gradually, then suddenly nightmare scenario for money printing. But I want to go into the DAO space, because I think that's really where there's so much potential, because this, like you said, this DAO's at scale, and no problems you can't solve. So let's go take that and start taking those concepts of decentralized governance, decentralized autonomous societies and organizations, and help us see your vision of the future for when it comes to swarm intelligence, collective intelligence, and we could talk about finance. I mean, we could talk about a bunch of things, or sustainability. Like you said, there's no problem that can't be solved, but for a lot of people, even those who are passionate about the space, they might believe in it, but the concrete steps or some of the challenges that we're going to face along the way, especially as it relates to governance and getting all these people aligned, how do you see, what do you see as some of the likely evolutionary paths for that as we start to, DAOs hit the mainstream, if you will?
Well, I think, I'm not sure. I mean, I follow Balaji, and Balaji basically thinks that this, global governance, stack is going to implode on itself, and that, it's going to be freeform, kind of like Snow Crash, where everyone goes up and like creates their own micro society and tries to like hold the fort on their own. And if that is the case, then basically, Bitcoin billionaires are going to need to start buying security companies and start, really like investing in the future of that more like hardened, deep
Citadel is real
infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, and that could be the future. I certainly wouldn't discount it as a possibility right now. And if it is, then there's a lot of things, that we just got to take for granted. I hate to say, I mean, as far as like the supply chain management and, our own security in most kind of developed countries and things like that. And so you step away. Like I was in Tulum before I was in Dubai, and I realized, there's certain things I just can't take for granted here that I'm used to taking for granted when I was in the U.S. So where does that leave us? I mean, it's a little bit speculative. I think one thing we definitely need, and this goes back to your question about swarm intelligence and kind of why I was originally so excited about this topic, is that we have the ability with blockchains as a tool to do economic modeling that is far more advanced than anyone has done in history. And it also goes into the smart city data architecture kind of world, because we literally can pick out, especially if we're starting new from a new society, and again, this is kind of like Balaji talks about this all the time. But if you have a new city that you're building from scratch, you can pick out the success factors. What is it? Are you maximizing GDP? Are you maximizing for health factors? How are you measuring? Are you measuring for the happiness of people? And, potentially you can capture all of that data reasonably easy today. And you can say, okay, we're going out with this very specific objective to, maximize these variables. This is how we're tracking it. This is our kind of, goal of doing it. And then that can very easily, rapidly iterate on itself and, outcompete other structures or produce IP that, bigger institutional kind of countries, et cetera, can use. I mean, just on a COVID thing, which is obviously very topical, like the Dubai where I am and, kind of working a little bit with the government of Dubai here to, capture some of the data, but they have very granular data on the beaches and where every COVID case happens. And so whenever there is an issue, they can easily say, okay, this beach area is where the new COVID cases are doing. We need to, decrease closing times from 1 back to 11 p.m. and, send some people over to more strictly enforce the distancing things between tables and, all this stuff. So you can basically do these kind of what I call a dynamic equilibrium model, kind of regional breakdown and, stuff like that is, more sophisticated. It's a more fast response to evolving conditions kind of model than, let's wait and see how much it spikes and then get paranoid and then close everything, sort of thing. And then wait until the numbers seem good.
It's like a brute force attack on the pandemic.
It's just, yeah, I mean, whatever. There's obviously a lot of people, but I think it's partially they're not trained to think about data. They don't really know what data they have. No one has really set it up, the infrastructure to deliver that data. And so, the response ends up being kind of delayed response and then, without the granular level of specificity that would be more helpful. And then, obviously with that, you can do things like keep gyms and other things that are conducive to health and mental health as well.
Right, being able to zoom in and zoom out. Let me ask, so if we can at the end, oh, sorry, go ahead. I apologize.
No, just saying that goes into the whole swarm intelligence thing. I mean, I don't think anyone's really doing this right now, but I know people who can, and I'm putting the groundwork into place to do this. But really breaking down, all of society into kind of user agents and the different types of people and their interactions and capturing the data so that really when you're building something from scratch, you can basically dynamically simulate an entire, smart city and say, okay, if we take this mix of demographics and these people together and this kind of thing, what is the net result going to look like? And, to the extent to which we can do that, we can, do really, really cool things. So, and blockchain is just an amazing tool because it's like open source data. The data is just all sitting there. It's like a petri dish for doing, economic innovation. So, I think, I'm hoping that some societies that are, otherwise going to be left behind, to be perfectly frank, are going to like wise up and say, let's put some resources, money, etc., academics, kind of towards these type of topics so that we can figure out the best way to evolve in these kind of situations.
I want to put a pin in the Tulum conversation because that's an area of interest, the Tulum lifestyle, shall we call it. So maybe at the end we can come back to that. But you said a lot of really interesting things there. The thing that I agree with you that blockchain is like this beautiful tabula rasa for crypto or economic design and game theoretic and mechanism design and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm almost hearing you say is that because we have this space where we can rapidly innovate and we can rapidly test and model, it's almost like you could design a token economic system and then run it through some sort of AI, singularity net, of course, led simulator to sort of see, well, how would this play out if we had combined it with the data from a city? And then I'm almost hearing you say, and tell me if I'm going down the wrong path here, I'm almost hearing you say like some of these places that, to your point, might be left behind could say, wait a second, let's run some simulations, let's figure out a new economic model, and they could experiment with 10, 15, 100 different mini economic city states to see which one thrives using the data and keeping it all decentralized to preserve privacy, but basically leapfrog from the centralized fiat system into sort of a decentralized economic system. Am I on the right track here, or am I just making stuff up?
Yeah, 100%. And you could say, like, the UK as an example, like, set up, 100 little microeconomic zones, within there, and the, let's say 1,000 to 5,000 person range, allow people to kind of pick the preconditions, track the data behind it. And, it would be obviously be more experimental. Not every experiment's going to succeed, so you have to be prepared for that. But the one thing that is amazing about this type of stuff too, and since you brought in the AI and singularity net, I think it would be super helpful, is that there's an interesting discovery mechanism in humans' relationship with AI, where AI is discovering all of these sort of better patterns of behavior that humans have neglected because, we are educated by people who came before us and they put some patterns in our thinking and whatever else. So every time you play chess, there's like certain standard openings that you're highly likely to do because you've seen them and they work and whatever else, and it's risky to try anything else. Whereas for the AI that can cycle through all the different permutations and backtrack whatever else, there's no risk involved, for trying those things, and as well they can see all the kind of observable possibilities and kind of iterate through them. So it's really, really interesting to see what they might discover. I don't know if you've ever heard of Christopher Alexander and pattern language.
Sounds interesting. Go.
This one community I'm working with now in Bali that's a 300 villa complex called Park that is a digital nomad hub, let's say. And I'm actually hoping to bring the brand global and working on various partnerships with them. And one of the founders was heavily influenced by this guy, Christopher Alexander, who was an architect, but he kind of wrote, it's always like a philosophical fashion, but it's like, what is the right number of windows per, square foot? What is the kind of proportions that these things need to be in, to have the like optimal flow, so to speak. It's almost like if you were to take, a math guy and try and systematize some sort of
like maximize, optimize for flow state,
but kind of at like a Yeah. I mean, it's very similar to what happened in that stuff, but like, then, how much, greenery does there need to be? How tall should things be? How large should the common areas be? Like all this stuff. I mean, you can look, he gives very specific guidelines for all of these different categories of things based on his experience. And he's also interesting in that he's kind of designing at like a village level, let's say. So it's not just about a single unit and, what the person inside, but how does the whole kind of community come together? And those type of dynamics are very interesting, in the sense that, and his work is very thought-provoking in that sense, because you start thinking about all these things that you never thought about before, And you might not agree with him, and it's actually very difficult to know what the data would be to really have a definitive judgment about many of the topics he writes about. But I can easily imagine someone setting in a kind of, let's say, meta language for architectural design that has various patterns and geometries and whatever else embedded in it, going in. I mean, biology likes to talk about VR, so let's say like VR, you design this like city, thing, people like populate the homes, and it goes out to like, some AI building things go out and like build all these different structures and stuff like that. And then you get all this interesting data on like, did this work? Like, does the mobile, like what if you can move your house, which you actually literally do this now, and I know people build this as well. You put the house on some kind of struts or wheels or whatever else, or some portion of bedrooms. And what if you gave the people permission to like move their unit every, 10 days or something like that, So then like the whole structure of your digital nomad hub is like a dynamic readjusting, thing, and people are kind of moving to different clusters.
It's like swarm intelligence sitting on top of a physical world, and the physical world responding, and you can self-organize with the people in your neighborhoods that are, if you're in the artistic mode today, and then a month later you're like, what, I want to nerd out with the hardcore geeks. You can sort of move around and go to different parts of the city, as it were.
100%, yeah. I mean, like, I want to get in the maker space and start doing some welding, or let's do like a welding, couple weeks, and then I'm back by the library zone or whatever, So these are all kind of interesting possibilities. I don't think they're all going to be built, overnight, but I think if we give people the freedom to do them, then people are going to innovate and, create amazing new worlds that are going to be, the patterns for future society. And the larger societies, as they make space for them, are going to be the ones that thrive and evolve and, become the future, basically.
As you're talking, I mean, my mind's kind of exploding here. I guess I'm having a nerdgasm, right? It's sort of, you're having that, it's almost like you model, there are going to be tools to help you model cryptoeconomic systems. And then there'll be AIs that it sounds like you're talking, and I thought I was coming up with this idea of like, AIs don't suffer from heuristic debt. They're not caught up in that. And then you could take that and deploy that into VR simulators for people to actually you could get the real data of how people behave. And then the ones that are most successful, then you could deploy potentially in the physical world, and you could run 10 million experiments or whatever all at once globally, and you give people a chance. And then you bring in that tech nature stuff that you were talking with the architect sort of framework. And you say, if you're doing this in sub-Saharan Africa, here are the 5, WordPress, templates that you want to deploy, kind of thing, versus the Arctic or whatever, and optimize for creativity and innovation. But I might be getting ahead of myself here.
Yeah, and I think that heuristic data is a great term to use, and it colors so much of what it colors so much of what we think about as governance, right? Whenever we go with governance, a lot of times we go, are you? And you're like, no, it's really, dynamic decision-making, methods that, are tiered to every process, leads to some kind of result, leads to some capital allocation, leads to something getting built or not getting built, and so once you break down the whole chain, there's so many different ways to optimize for, results that are positive.
Yeah. Okay. This is the part of the show, Joel, where you need to change your background. You got to keep it fresh for people, so that you show them how you can show up whatever you're feeling today, man.
You want to
I mean, in some
pirates,
respects, there are people who still view this world as full of pirates, and that's the only thing it's good for. So if you're feeling piratey and a little bit rebellious, that's good. Whatever works for you. We're equal opportunity filters. There we go. That's working for me. So now that you get the pirate hat on, why don't you talk a little bit about the evolution of jurisprudence, because pirates and jurisprudence naturally go together. So help us sort of understand what your thoughts are. That, like, we've seen some really interesting experiments in this space. The one that comes to mind for me is the Aragon Court and the Aragon Network Jurisdiction and their efforts, which may or may not have worked, depending on whatever. But it was a really interesting idea to decentralize juries, essentially. So what are some of the research, what are some of the thoughts that you have around that, and how that plays into some of the things we've been talking about?
I've actually been involved in a fair number of like DAO fallouts already.
We need DAO insurance. That's going to be a whole
and
category.
I don't actually know if I've been I know, because you're like, one of the things you appreciate in retrospect, about the legal system, because usually you're like, oh, I want to build a whole new future and I don't need all those pesky, laws and lawyers and everything. And then, once you get in a while, you're like, oh, well, one of the things that legal systems do really well is cover edge cases, because they've just been evolving, as you might call it bloat, but a big part of the bloat is like figuring out what to do if someone like trips, falls down on their face, goes to the hospital, and then becomes, incapacitated as they were about to sign the contract, And we're like, oh, well, what do we do now? Is he about to sign the contract, but now he can't sign, whatever, So anyways, I don't have the legal training to answer that specific question, but I know that, lots of people around the world know the answer to that question in various jurisdictions. And it also makes it a challenging, arena to innovate in if you're trying to create something from scratch. Pirates is so interesting because there's a really big gap between how pirates are remembered and treated in popular media and then how they actually evolved. And
educate me. I'm listening.
So a couple of different things, but one is that, most of the pirates were originally working for the Queen or some government, and the reason they became pirates is because they signed a treaty so that they weren't allowed to be piracy anymore. And so, but these people had been trained by their own governments basically to be privateers and prey, like on the Spanish fishing lines. So they didn't have anything else to do, among other things, and they were in this area that was basically unclaimed. It's like kind of an interesting thing that comes to DAOs as well. There literally was no governance there. Like, it was an empty zone, So it basically forced people to go out and create something. And obviously, there was a mix of people who kind of fell into that milieu of, professional pirates, so to speak. But a fair number of them were basically created by this gap in governments, and then a similar thing happened in the Cold War, other things like that, basically governments wanting to disavow actions of people that they had basically sponsored. So, and say, oh, it wasn't us. And then a good portion of them, too, which is really interesting, is that they were really struggling to be at the forefront of, contemporary social issues. So the sort of system of governance in, like, the classic pirate ship was, in some ways, the purest form of democracy that has existed, and certainly predates the American-style democracy by, like, I don't know, 80 years or more. So pretty significant, and obviously they were maligned and all these other things, got a bad reputation for various reasons, some probably legitimate, probably some not. But, what happened is in a pirate ship, for example, the crew elected the captain, and the captain had basically a full responsibility of how to manage the crew, especially in combat situations, because it was a very strict hierarchy. You can't, like, step out of it. When you're in a battle, you can't question your superior's orders. You have to go through it. Anything else was basically considered mutiny, and all of that. But then if the people, not in a combat situation thought the captain wasn't doing a good job, they could basically just meet together and vote him out of office and be like, see ya, you're not really a very good captain. And a lot of things too regarding, women and the inclusion of women and things like that were done very first in kind of pirate circles. And pirates, were kind of more in like racial integration. I mean, all this stuff. Like they were just not. They were willing to try new things that the rest of society took a good century really to even catch up with and think about. And it was done far away from the rest of mainstream society. So when people started writing the stories, they wrote the tall tales of the pirates and all the most things that were likely to get made like kind of the comic book version of it. So a lot of the real pirate annals, are still. It's
really interesting. It's almost like they had their own. I'm hearing you say they had their own sort of mini swarm intelligence, which is okay for now. You're the captain, based on the information that comes about from the last interaction or exchange we had, where you basically screwed up big time. We've self-organized and we're saying, sorry, you're getting demoted and somebody else is taking the role. And it's basically between the racial and the women, it's everyone has an opportunity to earn a spot in this group. And if you contribute, just like we expect people to contribute in DAOs and decentralized networks, you've got a place here. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, in some ways one of the purest forms of meritocracy in that sense, because, you're in a ship that has a very specific, mode, and, in some ways, like I said, it's even sponsored by the government. So but you have, everyone has to be working on it. You can't just bring people along who aren't contributing in the context of a tiny ship, Another one, it's a really interesting side topic, but, I'm fascinated about these subjects as well. Sometimes it gets me into trouble. But in one of the pirate, like their initiation rituals, and there was one we kind of actually within our Burning Man camp played with this one as an idea, but it was this like wenching ritual, and it's very, very interesting. But basically, the men of the pirate crew, when they were potentially basically applying to be part of the crew, had to demonstrate an act of sexual prowess. And then the woman who was kind of there would basically evaluate them publicly in front of the crew to see if they were, capable enough to be a pirate, which is very interesting as well. Like, and you think about like contemporary job interviews and all the different things people have done, militaries. Like, no one really does that, but like, maybe it's an important part. Like, maybe you should have like a degree of sexual capability.
I gotta ask, how did this get deployed in Burning Man?
Like,
if you're comfortable, because I have all kinds of.
Oh yeah, I mean,
I really want to hear what you're about to say.
We can. It's probably better to talk in, amongst pirate circles, about some of these things, so to speak. So, but we do have an ongoing. There's a book out called "Be More Pirate," and it basically applies pirate type thinking to kind of business consulting and stuff like that. And we've been in touch with the kind of author and them, and then as well another group of like pirate-minded people, on the West Coast to see how this can be applied. So particularly this year when Burning Man, supposedly didn't happen, there were kind of a lot of pirates doing things, believe it or not. So who didn't seem to think that was very important whether or not it was like officially going on. And looking more broadly about what we can learn and apply.
So if you were to take the lessons of Be More Pirate and give us maybe 2 or 3 takeaways, what creeds or what sort of mantras would you say? Hey, Joel, I want to be more pirate in my thinking. What are sort of the mantras that I should be repeating to myself?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's all about art.
I gotcha.
No, but no, to have an artful life or whatever else. I mean, a colorful, interesting life. Like you should be aiming for that, I guess. I mean, don't allow other people to put you within their form of what like a Lego block looks like. I mean, unless you really like Lego blocks. I happen to like Lego blocks, but you can also make pirate ships with Lego blocks. But there's a lot of things out there that basically we just, to your point, you have a heuristic debt about, and we're just carrying it along without realizing it. Like, back to our DAO conversation, so much of us have a heuristic debt around what a job looks like, what a company looks like, what a stock table looks like. I mean, and in fact, a lot of the DAO stuff, like back in 2014, the first white paper I wrote after the Ethereum white paper was about reputational systems, which was actually kind of a topical issue, big, that Vitalik was interested in and talked about, and then basically people stopped working on this particular issue, and he kind of noted in his update, like in last December or something. He's like, it kind of like didn't really make that much progress in reputational systems. But like, why not? Like, why are reputational currency, so to speak, or access by reputation potentially more interesting than fungible money that you transfer together and that everyone has? So, I think in some ways the NFT space now, particularly if it involves like access tokens and things like that along the way, may be kind of rediscovering some of these, patterns back from 2014 and, even beyond. I mean, other types of crew and, initiations. And
it's interesting.
Societies and like all the fun
full
stuff.
Disclosure, I served as an advisor to DAOstack, and Matan's whole theory, Matan Field, the founder there, he's like DAOs at scale rely on reputation systems. It's not about voting power based on how much money you have. You have to have this reputation system. Otherwise, you don't know. You can't make those decisions about who really is the best captain for that particular journey. And I'm actually, so it's interesting that you brought up NFTs, because I wanted to sort of pivot as we head towards our descent here. And I know you've got some appointments later, so we want to respect your time. But let's talk about NFTs, and then I want to close out with MetaMask, because that's the question everyone's going to ask. We'll hold that to the end. But have you been surprised by how quickly the NFT thing's blown up, or you sort of, like, what's your reaction as you see this? Just, it's in every mainstream publication now. How are you reacting? Do you think it's just, is it hype cycle? Is it hype cycle and here to stay? Is it we're just at the beginning and we're not even hitting a hype cycle? How are you responding to what's going on right now?
I think it's totally nuts, but it's mostly good in the sense that, people like myself have been writing about NFTs and trying to figure out valuation criteria and DAOs and NFTs for, at least a year or more. And then the fact that everyone cares about them means that some of these things are starting to get developed, and it's a lot easier to convince people to finance projects around these things and, go through that whole process. So, and I think realistically, market cap around NFTs could go 5 to 10x of what ICOs were. I mean, there's so many good application areas for this type of technology that, it even goes into like the broader tokenization, like you're tokenizing things. But, there's a bunch of models that still haven't really been tried or deployed in the wild and, are really interesting. So I think maybe the digital art bubble at the moment may dissipate, and certain things will kind of pop. I mean, will CryptoPunks hold their value? I don't know for sure. But the broader thing, I think, you probably see, one of these just massive, bubble type things, and then it will pop, and then good stuff will be left over.
Jeffrey Moore chasm and the Carlotta Perez installation, and that'll just keep playing out as we go in. And then NFTs to me and gaming is just you think art is big. Wait till we get to all the video gamers out there. I mean, that's going to be ridiculous. But wow, I feel like I could talk to you for.
Yeah, and I've been playing with that quite a bit because I don't think that our current blockchain infrastructure can support like any of the type of explosion in NFTs that is happening right now. So I think we're going to have to see like a whole new flourishing of blockchain related thing to support that as well. So that's one of the big things I'm involved in right now is the kind of research phase of what it takes to do blockchain,
like serious layer one scalability.
NFT specifically.
So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, back to layer one again, but like with instead of like pursuing it as an intellectual problem, pursuing it as like a necessity behind very specific
this might get me in trouble with you or the audience, but what the heck? So, my technology career goes all the way back to the mid '80s when I got my first Mac. Even before that, I had like this Sony thing. But I think about Internet 1.0, and as exciting it was to use the earliest Mosaic web browser and things like that, and you saw these first iterations of new possibilities, whether it was Netscape or AOL or CompuServe and Prodigy before that. So there are days where I look at this and I say, wow, Ethereum is amazing, but what if it's like the CompuServe Prodigy of its era because it's not able to solve that scaling? On the other side, I say, well, what's different here is obviously there's a ton of actual skin in the game, a lot of research going on to it. And I don't want you to say, oh, yes, it will make it or won't make it. But the fact that we've seen this series proofs of concept, if you will, around DeFi, around NFTs, we know it's working, and now you have to go back to that layer one research and say, well, either how do we do it with the existing system, or is there a need for different types of specialized blockchain just for NFTs, just for DeFi, and then have that interoperability? So, I'm not necessarily asking you for a comment. I'll definitely take one, but I'd be interested in sort of what your research is starting to uncover as you think about what will be the characteristics of the layer ones that ultimately, based on your hypothesis, will be successful to support the kind of scale that we think is most likely, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure about this, so this is like kind of hypothetical in some ways, but I think there's a good chance that it will be more of a step-up function than an incremental innovation, And I think that there are some system architectures out there that, are arguably better, at scale that don't come out of the, let's say, iterative version from like a more purist decentralization model. Obviously, for everyone who is like a more purist around those things, they're always unsettled by some of these other sort of network topologies. But, but there's more choices than, having all of your money stored on someone else's bank server and then, decentralization in the kind of fullest sense of that. So, there's federated models, there's really a lot of other stuff that's out there.
Yeah. Well, I guess the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up, and we didn't even touch on holonic philosophy, which I'm going to have to Google unless you can give me the one sentence explanation on that one. Go, I'm ready. Go.
I'll give you the one sentence one. For sure. So the most basic version of it, it comes from Arthur Koestler and many things looking at biological systems and all that. But what it is basically saying for our evaluative mechanism of the health or prospect of anything, we don't want to use anything that is an external evaluation. So basically, if we're looking at the health of cellular life or an individual, we want to do something that is based on the statistics of the system. So, and I think we can do that kind of from a bottom-up approach, but to the extent to which we can do it and we can remove these sort of external taxonomies, like saying, like, did God say this is good? Would be like one classic one, And then how did God say it was good? Well, it's in this book and blah, blah, blah. That's not a holonic way of evaluating things.
Well, that sounds like a little bit what you're describing
that's
about with Dubai
version.
and smart cities then, because, Dubai is saying we're not going to just let somebody say, oh, there's a wave in Europe and we got to just shut everything down because we need. It's like, no, we're seeing what's happening in the gyms and the data and the beaches and blah, blah, blah. And based on that, what's happening in the Dubai system, if you will, we're making decisions. Am I connecting the dots accurately?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the direction, that all this stuff needs to go in, and it basically comes down to the purity of your data. If you let other people define, the categories for you, even the most individual thing, if you let other people decide what makes you happy.
That's true. That's not living the pirate lifestyle by any stretch. Yeah. You're being a pirate with all these filters
It's
you've been
definitely
throwing at
not
us
a
throughout this
pirate,
call. So I
but
love that you're demoing, in real time. All right, Joel, last
I
question I got to
know.
ask, MetaMask. I mean, first of all, seriously, and I mean this, I'm grateful to you for having done what you did because it's one of those things where once you experience the MetaMask UX and the single sign on and all that, you're just like, oh my God, the other system is so stupid. So, you opened up a whole realm of possibility for people who are sort of at that next layer of technical capability. So, seriously, man, thank you for your contribution. But I got to ask you, when you look back at the way you built it, what are the things that you're now sort of kicking yourself? Like, oh, I wish I'd thought of X or Y, or I would have done this differently, or maybe there's nothing, but I'm just curious.
Well, yeah, just to go back to the beginning, I mean, it was maybe my idea or other people's idea. DevCon Zero was the one who kind of got its initial momentum, but I wrote like basically zero of the code that is MetaMask, and the lion's share of the effort was borne by
Fair enough. Fair
engineers that
enough.
were in the trenches, and so I would not like to take credit away from them, despite having pushed it forward and recognized there was a need, and got it its initial funding and some other things. So. But yeah, I think it can always be better, and I think one of the things that's I guess maybe tries to be is just making things better. I don't know, and so I think there's still a lot of opportunity. I mean, I'm really happy that it exists. I think I generally feel extremely positive about the fact and how it's developed, and the reach it has, and enabling all this stuff. And it was super clear that we needed that kind of bridge development within the Ethereum ecosystem. An original conception was actually supposed to be a community-owned project, which interestingly back tokenization community ownership. That was part of the licensing that was in the original version. So I think that could be really interesting as an evolution. Another evolution, is really just kind of going back into, what is a kind of most clean UX that kind of really reaches out into the mainstream and integrates with the social media universe. Because,
Right.
There's other people that are, stuck inside Facebook and some version of Facebook's app and stuff like that. And obviously they're trying to, force feed everyone like their version of a cryptocurrency, which they're calling the cryptocurrency because they hope they can get around the regulation. But they don't really care about cryptocurrency. I think everyone should realize that. So who has at least a tiny bit of intelligence. So, so like what are we doing, around those topics and kind of really reaching that? I think it's still a real question, and I think it's, I think the NFT and engaging artists is really exciting. Those people, and I've been in a bunch of rooms recently where people are like discovering and talking about MetaMask for like the first time and talking about how it works. And it's actually very gratifying for me to be someone just kind of lurking almost in these rooms where people are discussing something that you sort of founded, and sometimes they don't even give you a chance to speak, which is maybe less gratifying. But still, it's like it's cool to see their discovery process, but it also makes me realize, the work that is to be done around these things, particularly, if you wanted to go beyond like an early adopter, digital visionary artist people into like a registry for all digital art, and the licensing that would have to happen. Like, I don't know if
I love Trent. He's one of
who
the
actually
best.
works with Vitalik. He's now doing Ocean Protocol, but that was like when somebody's his original. Oh yeah, Trent is incredible, right? So that was kind of original thing that he was doing with the Scribe way before Ocean Protocol. Is like, how can we do a digital registry of assets on a blockchain that then potentially includes the licensing, includes the revenue stream distribution, and all those things that you can theoretically do. You've been able to do them theoretically, but we still haven't gotten the technology to that point. That I guess I still feel like we're another 5-10 years from having some of these things built. We'll go through some other giant hype cycle. It'll probably partially implode. People will be like, oh, those NFTs were stupid, and then something will actually get built, and then at some point, hopefully, we'll have that version of it. But it may not be. To your point, it may
Trent
not be with the blockchains.
I could have a whole call just on Trent and data tokens and he had an amazing post about 2 years ago. I think it was called Nature 2.0. So it comes back to the sustainability and how we start making nature part of the DAOs, and trees having their own sort of governance token, if you will. So, there's a lot of things. I mean, I think it goes back to your earliest days as well with some of these putting trees and the trust, as it were, on the blockchain. There's a really interesting project down in Brazil called Moss.Earth where they're tokenizing carbon credits and sort of doing that. So there's a lot of really interesting experiments in that, but we could spend all day on that. But listen, man, this has been amazing. I'm really, really grateful for you taking out the time to chat with us. I know you've got a busy schedule, and the Singularity Net community is obviously grateful for it as well. If people are interested in following your thought patterns or staying connected in some way to what you're doing, do you have any place where they should go? Is it a Twitter? Is it Clubhouse? Is it some decentralized network I've never heard of? What should we be doing if we want more of Joel?
You can follow me on Twitter. I mean, most of the NFT projects I'm working on right now, I can't talk about, but when I can, they'll probably find out pretty easily. And yeah, there is definitely a good reason for having a more decentralized version of Clubhouse right now. So if you're interested
Joel,
in that,
this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for making all the time, and best of luck in continuing to fight the battles of bringing the decentralized world to the present quickly as possible. So continued success, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy, for your time, and my best to all of your listeners. So.